Welcome to So Much Crime, So Little Time. I'm Dee.
And I'm Jeff. Through March 2nd, you can see Doodler at the Theater Rhinoceros in San Francisco. The play is conceived and performed by John Fisher, and you can go to therhino.org for more details, and we'll also have a link to it in our show notes.
The Theater Rhinoceros was founded in 1977, and it's the longest running queer theater in America. This episode here is a special episode related to our coverage of the Doodler podcast. If you haven't listened to our episodes on the Doodler podcast, that's okay. This is a standalone episode.
Here we're interviewing Chris Mancini. He is a board member of the Theater Rhinoceros. Chris spent 25 years in the tech world doing marketing management. He had a strong background in theater from when he was in college, including running his college theater group. And he got involved with the Theater Rhinoceros as a way to both get back involved with the theater and also to drive awareness around queer community spaces. So we hope you enjoy this interview with Chris.
He's a delight, and don't forget to leave us a review and send us in comments and your thoughts on this episode. Chris, thanks for joining us today. We'd love to start off just learning a little bit more about you and your role with Theater Rhinoceros.
Yeah, no, thanks. Thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it. Yeah, I decided relatively recently to join the board of Theater Rhinoceros to kind of get back to my roots in theater. I had done a ton of theater in college and acted and did stage managing and a bunch of things and loved it. And then as I kind of became like a professional or whatever, I sort of fell away from it. And as I've gotten older and also living in the Castro and being a gay man and all the things that kind of make me a person now, I thought, it would be great to, one, be able to get back into theater, but then also be able to stay connected to the community. And so Theater Rhinoceros is right around the corner from our house. We've been subscribers to it for years, and I thought it would be a great way to be able to give back in two ways that meant a ton to me. So
yeah, I love that. Come here, I'd love to know what your favorite production has been, whether it's been at Theater Rhinoceros or in your younger theater days.
Yeah, at Theater Rhinoceros, they just did a production, and it's not just a recency thing, but they just did a production of Cabaret, which was by far one of the best pieces of theater I've seen ever. And not that I'm some crazy theater expert, but it was so well done, was, I think, so poignant and timely right now with a lot of the things that are going on. And given that they're a very small local theater, what they were able to do with the space and the performances was just, it was wild. It was amazing. So I loved it. Told everybody to go see it. It sold out. They had to extend it, and I wish it could come back. When I was in theater, I acted in a show. It's a David Mamet show called All Men Are Whores, and it was probably the favorite. It was the favorite thing that I did. It was a series of monologues, and I played multiple characters, but it was a ton of fun, and probably, that was my favorite show. But I think monologues are pretty cool because the actor has to convey everything without having anyone to interact with, and so I think that's pretty powerful. So, yeah.
I love that. I want to look up this All Men Are Whores. It feels a little bit like, I don't know if either of you have ever seen the vagina monologues. That's what I'm imagining, but kind of, men.
But a little different. But yeah, and I was excited. Like, granted, I was 20 at the time, or 21, but I got to smoke in it, and I was really excited because and so I think it caused me to become a smoker for a little bit, but I was so excited I got to light a cigarette on stage and smoke. So that was the opening cue of the play. I flicked the lighter, and then the spotlight went on me, and then I started speaking. So
I love that.
Yeah.
I must look that one up.
Yeah, it was a fun one. I think I may have a copy of it. I'll look for it.
Let's talk a little bit about this play.
Yeah.
So I think it's just called Doodler. He doesn't call it The Doodler. Is that right?
Yeah, it's just called Doodler. Yeah. And it was written and performed by John Fisher, who's the artistic director at the theater.
What? So you've seen the production, right?
I have. Yeah, I saw it last week.
Can you just tell us a little bit about, like, it sounds like kind of a unique theater experience.
Yeah, it's actually really unique, and I think it sort of lends itself to some of the eeriness of the whole show. John is very interested in making it a true one-man show. So he does absolutely everything. So when you walk into the theater, he is setting things up. He's preparing the refreshments. He checks you in. He runs the lights. He calls the cues. He does the sound. So and he acts in it. So it's truly a one-man show to the point where there's no one else there, and he locks up the theater and leaves at the end. So there's something really, I think, unique and interesting about that. But then he also plays multiple characters in the show. But it does sort of leave you with this sort of eerie feeling of, as he's telling this story, you and he are really the only ones there, and there's something just a little you feel a little awkward, and I think that awkwardness is important when you think about what you're witnessing or hearing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'd say even like the awkwardness, like in comparison to the awkward eerie vibe that we got from the listening to the podcast that was around San Francisco at the time for gay men. So like just reflecting that in the vibes, that's really interesting.
Yeah, and even the story, like, so even like right when you walk in, it's awkward because he's like, "Hey, how's it going?" And you're like, "Hey," and he seats you, and so you're a little off put from the very start. And when you think about some of the interactions that the Doodler had with his victims, those were fairly awkward as well. And so I think I know that a big piece of that is what he's trying to convey. The fact that he walked up to these victims with a doodle and showed it to them, and they were puzzled by what it was, and they felt a little awkward, and they were lured into going with him. Because of that, I feel like you're sort of doing that with John during the show as well, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. What has the audience reaction been to the show?
They like it. Well, first they like it, but there's nervous energy from the very beginning of not understanding what's going on. The music that John's using, I should have looked it up before this, but it's also very, very eerie, and it's just playing throughout the entire time of when you're waiting for the show to start. There was even 10 minutes of silence where the music stops and nothing's happening and he's not there, and everyone before it begins, and everyone in the audience is just like, what? God. And like it's just it's really weird, like, and it's awkward, and like everybody's just kind of like, what is happening? And then all of a sudden he comes out. And so I think the more you dissect it and the more you see it, it's just really interesting. But I think there could be some folks that are just like, they feel awkward, and they're like, I don't like this.
Yeah. Well, that kind of gets to my next question, which was, what do you see, or maybe if you know from talking to John Fisher, like who is this for? Like, is it for people who have any familiarity with the case, or like are completely coming kind of new to the story?
Yeah, I think it's for a combination. Like, I know that he is very connected to the character that he's playing, who basically tried to sort of solve the case on their own. And so I think for John, and I can't speak for him, but I think there's a piece of trying to tell that story of just the maniacal desire to figure out what the hell was going on at the time and why this was happening and why the police didn't care and all of that. So I think he wants to tell that story, the story of those that were trying to solve it at the time and those that felt forgotten, right? Because again, and even now, right, I think there's something that kind of connects a little bit with a lot of the political environment that's going on. Like the populations are trying to be erased or forgotten or whatever. And so I think John's trying to tell the story because that's fucked up, right? And that shouldn't have happened. And it happens too many times with a ton of different minorities, right? But if it's a little white girl who goes missing or who gets murdered, then it's on the news, front and center. So
it was one of my questions actually to bring to you, was like, because Jeff and I note this all the time when we're trying to choose podcasts to review, we're often trying to move away from the white woman who's covered and who is like, there's a lot of coverage there, and we're trying to move into to speak about the victims and tell the story of victims from more kind of marginalized communities. But also, you're so right. I feel like it's often not reported on, or like it's forgotten about. And we heard that in episode 1 of this podcast and this story, how it was like buried in the newspapers.
Yes.
But also something you touched on is like, given the current political climate at the moment, it's even more important to speak about the victims in this case. It's a cold case. Likely people involved are not still around or are like much older. But like but we it's something that we're really trying to like zone in on. And we think the podcast, I know you listened to episode 1 of the podcast. The podcast in general is very victim forward, very much trying to bring the humanity of each of the victims out. I'm wondering, like, from the play, is that something that is focused on as well?
Absolutely.
Is like really bringing out the victims?
Yeah, John. So they talk quite a bit about the different victims. He focuses on 1 or 2, because there were 6 that they knew about, but it was up to 16 or so that they think may have been the victims. John focuses on, I believe, 3 in the show very, very, very much, and those were the ones that were a little more publicized. There was also a survivor.
The diplomat, or the diplomat.
And so that is interesting too, and he focuses on that quite a bit. But I think he tells the story also from like not just the victim, but those around the victim. So one of the performers that it was a drag queen who was murdered.
Oh,
is that Jay?
Jay Stevens?
Jay Stevens.
Yeah. And so the way he depicts that and the community around that character and how it impacted them was pretty amazing as well. Because I think that's a lot of what you like. Of course, it's terrible for the victim, but for the community left behind, that's then feeling marginalized, feeling victimized, feeling like no one's there to support them. I think it's a unique perspective of like, they're just scared shitless, right? And they don't know, and they feel powerless, right? But again, that's happening these days with a lot of the trans hate and the things that are going on, and the bully, and the kids that just don't get any representation. So, and
it feels as well like it's same now, but by the signs of it, same in the 70s for gay men who didn't feel like they were able to be themselves, so they had to hide in the shadows. So the chances of someone coming forward or speaking out, even if they could at the time, was unlikely because of the impact it would have on their family, their friends, their job. Like there was so much layered to it, and it goes back to how abuse gets hidden so often in the church or whatever. It's because we don't speak about those things. We don't speak about this, that's in the shadows, we don't talk about it. And if we do that, like you're putting a cloak over and allowing someone to come in and
it is. I mean, and even today, like, you think about it. I mean, back then, my goodness, like that's crazy. It was in the 70s. Like it's so different than it was today. But I think up until, maybe 10 years ago, I would say things had changed a lot in the US and where we were. But I think now with a lot of what's happened politically, you even have people in the Bay Area who I think are afraid, right? They're afraid to say things or report things, and part of me is like, how the fuck how did we get here again, right? And again, it's no shade against anyone who feels unsafe, but it's interesting that we came pretty far, and then I feel like we've fallen back a little bit, or a lot.
I want to ask about that because I was actually looking up pictures from 1974, 1975 in like the Castro, like some of the parades and things and public things that were happening. And it was interesting to me to look at some like historical photos from 50 years ago and feel like I've seen like what happens at like gay pride in San Francisco these days. I feel like it's in some ways it's not that different from what was happening 50 years ago.
No, and I don't think it is. I think it's interesting. Like I think look, I grew up in the 70s, so I was born in 72. I was a gay like going to gay prides and stuff in the 90s, and I remember thinking like I was so lucky because it was very similar to what you saw, and even today to what you saw back in the 70s, but those people were really fighting and were really putting a lot on the line, right? Like they are like fucking heroes, you know? I mean, like for what they did, and now we sort of, well, I think up until a few years ago, we really took that for granted. And I think I'm not suggesting that it brings the community, that it's good for the community, but I do think it has brought us, I think it's just been a wake up call recently where we're like, wait a minute, like we may have to start fighting again. We may have to start, and by fight, I don't necessarily mean violence. I just mean standing up for ourselves and doing things because, like did back then. And by the way, they did it and they got us through it and we'll be okay. Right. So I think there's a lot of nuance to all of that. But yeah, they didn't give a fuck. Right. And they were risking a ton for what they were doing. Yeah.
Yeah. One other thing I wanted to ask kind of related to that is one thing that the podcast talked about was how in the 70s, a lot of these men came to San Francisco. They weren't born there. Like they came there because it was seen as sort of a safer place, not necessarily a safe place, but a safer place than wherever they came from, whether that was somewhere else in the U.S. or somewhere else in the world. And I'm curious. I feel like is that still a thing today? Like, is that still like I feel like there are a lot of places in the country where it seems less safe than California or San Francisco.
Yeah, I mean, I know for Brian, my husband and I know that it is and it was. And I think it's, to be completely honest, like it's one of the reasons why we stay. There are plenty of reasons to leave San Francisco. You know, there are many reasons that and the older we get, it's like, my God, sometimes I crave the suburbs, but there's something really special to me when I was a little gay boy and a gay teenager thinking of the Castro and Castro Street. And now we own a home on Castro Street, one of the gayest streets in America or in the world, right? And that's really important to me to own a piece of that history. Harvey Milk's camera shop is literally 10 houses down from our house. And so for me, and I think for my generation, like the Gen X folks, a lot of us came here because of that. I think the younger folks, I don't know that the ones in California did because but there are folks from like I have seen younger folks from other areas of the country that come here just because of the safety and the history, right? There's just something there, and that's what I think that's beautiful. But then I also think, right, I kind of argue in my head sometimes like, well, wait a minute, if we want true equality and integration, then do we really need these ghettos, right? Do we need the gay ghetto anymore? Do we need to all be around one another anymore? And I used to think, no, maybe that's going to go away. But now over the past few years, I'm like, no, we do need it because there's some strength in numbers.
Right.
Although I can't say, and I had this conversation the other day with a friend, like it sometimes when I let my mind wander, I'm like, God, are we in danger living here? You know, like, are we in danger living on this street or whatever with just the way things have gotten recently? And that's weird too, right? So
to even consider it.
To even consider that, right? But I mean, I don't know, like 2 months ago, a group of like people rode their cars down really loud, honking the horns and yelling faggot out the windows, right? Like a group of like 20 cars. And I'm like, what is happening? Like, what? You know, like it's just goofy. Yeah.
Yeah, it's wild. It feels like the things that weren't socially acceptable, you know, like that people would be like, absolutely not. For so long is now creeping back in. That it's something actually kind of connected to one of the parts of the podcast that we heard about. I'm wondering if you've heard of this before. They're called the Butterfly Brigade. Had you heard of that?
No, but I'm thinking it may be almost like the the folks in New York that go around and like, are they like, do they patrol the streets to keep people safe?
Yeah, back
Okay.
in the
Yeah.
70s, while all of this was kicking off, it was like a group of people. Harvey Milk was like one of the people who would
Oh, I didn't even know that.
volunteer.
Yeah.
And it was noted he would volunteer like everybody else, like
Yeah.
he wouldn't want special treatment. And people stood around kind of just monitoring things.
Hmm.
And if someone drove down the street shouting slurs out the window, they would take the registration plate. They
Really?
would find the address of the person and send them a letter. So whether the letter is going to the mother or the father of the teenager who's driving the car,
Oh,
or
wow.
whether it's going to the person and just saying like, we saw you, like,
Yeah.
this is not acceptable, blah, 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 like whatever
That's
it is. But it's
amazing.
kind of like killing it with kindness in a way is
Yeah.
what I was getting from it. And
Yeah.
I just thought like when you brought that up, the butterfly
Yeah.
brigade was definitely something that came to mind.
No, I love that. It's almost like the did you ever see the show The Laramie Project, or the movie The Laramie Project? And so when they raise their wings to block out Fred Phelps, it's kind of a similar thing. Yeah.
It's fine. I haven't seen it, but we talked about this. We did a episode
Oh,
on
Podcast.
a Laramie story, and this
yeah.
came up there. It's like
You should
it's
you should see the movie for sure, but the play actually premiered at Berkeley Rep
oh,
years ago, and the play was gorgeous. The movie's good too, but the play was really, really, really amazing. But yeah, they blocked out the hate with angel wings so that you couldn't see Fred Phelps, who was protesting the funeral. And yeah, there is something to be said about that. I don't, this story's goofy and you probably cut it out, but during COVID, I had a run-in once on the street with a guy. It was like mid-COVID, and I was walking the dog, and I threw my dog poop in some guy's like trash can that was on the curb waiting to get picked up, and the guy like started yelling at me, and we started fighting, which like I don't even like, not fight, like not physically, but we started arguing and like yelling at each other. And then like I walked home and I was like, that's one of the, like, what just happened? Like why did I get so upset? And it was obviously like deep COVID anxiety and anger.
Stress and
And
yeah.
so I wrote him, I wrote him a note, and I wrote a note and I said, hey dude, that I just fought with, and I wrote a note and said, I'm really sorry, blah blah, I wasn't my best self, and I left it on his door. And a week later, like I saw him on the street, and I just kind of nodded my head, and he was like, hey, are you the guy that like I had that run-in with and you left me that note? And I was like, yeah. And he was like, that was the nicest thing that anyone's ever done. He's like, and I felt it was so sweet that you did that. And like, and we're now like friends. And like, it kind of speaks to that same thing where like, I was like, why did I yell at this dude? And let's like fix it with just a handwritten note, you know? I don't know. It was,
a great story. I like that.
Yeah.
It is a great story. I
it
love
was,
them.
yeah, he's also very cute, but that's a whole other story.
Actually, I wanted to ask you. So, how long have you lived in San Francisco? Has it been?
Yeah, I moved here in 95. Well, 95 to 96 I lived in Marin, and that was a disaster, and then I moved to the Castro in 96. So,
Okay.
yeah, 29 years. And within the same block, within the same block, like multiple places, but within the same like 1.5 block radius. So it's kind of crazy.
How have you seen it change over those decades?
Yeah, I mean, the Castro itself, because I've always lived in the Castro's changed a lot more from like, I think when I first moved here, there was a lot of like the nightlife scene was big. You got a lot more tourists coming to the neighborhood. There was a lot more of the, what we talked about earlier, like folks coming to kind of be able to hold hands for the first time in public or kiss in public. You saw a lot of that. You even saw it up to like a few years before COVID, but then once COVID hit, the neighborhood, and once the apps started becoming a lot more popular, so there's no, there was a big reason for us to go out to gay bars, was because there was really nowhere else to be able to be yourself and to be able to hit on each other and be able to do whatever you wanted. When the apps came out, so Grindr and Scruff and Tinder and all of those, you now don't have to do that. And then that combined with COVID, really the neighborhood now has kind of transitioned more to, there are a few places that folks still go out, but I think you more find community at like the dog parks or things like that, because there's no need to have to go to a bar to meet people. You can do it in many different ways. So it's still there, but I would say that it's not as crowded as it used to be. And again, that could be a good thing because we're able to go to other neighborhoods and feel safe as opposed to having to be here. So I don't know if it's necessarily a bad thing, but I still, like I said earlier, think like owning a piece of the street is just really important to me, and it's really important to that little gay kid. And so even when I get mad about the noise or the whatever, I think to that I always wanted to do this when I was a little kid. So yeah.
I actually was just looking at a picture of Harvey Milk at his camera shop
Yeah.
today. What is that? Still a camera shop? Like, what is that spot
No,
now?
right now it's an art gallery. It's called Queer AF. So and it stands for Queer Arts Featured, but I guess it could also stand for Queer as Fuck. And so the guy, I forget his name, but he has a ton of different queer artists that have their art in there, and it's also a store, and he sells everything from art as far as like paintings, photographs, sculptures, and then also fashion and jewelry. It's pretty cool, and they have a lot of events in that space. So it's cool that it's still being used. It was empty for a really long time, which was kind of sad. And then before it was empty, it was the Human Rights Campaign. They had a store there, but then that closed. So
Okay.
it's been a number of different things. I think it should be a museum, but who am I?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Something that comes up in the podcast is kind of Harvey Milk's story, kind of tangential to this, the Doodler story. I mean, he was obviously very active in the community in the 70s.
Yep.
And one thing that I was reflecting on was how now there's like the Harvey Milk terminal at SFO, and like his name is still sort of out there. And I was just curious what maybe kind of from your perspective his legacy is.
Yeah. I mean, anywhere in the neighborhood. So there's also Harvey Milk Elementary School, which is 2 blocks from my house. Although it's closing, I believe, because they're closing a ton of schools in San Francisco. But that's been there for years. And then there's Harvey Milk Plaza, which is the Muni station of the Castro too. So he is, and there's one of his quotes is on a building right on the corner of 18th and Castro. So, I mean, he's represented everywhere in the neighborhood, and almost everybody knows who he is. And I think a lot of it is not just that he was so open and out and important in that regard, but then his death also, I think, resonates with a lot of folks. The fact that he was murdered, right, by another supervisor who used basically the weirdest defense ever. The Twinkie defense was his defense. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of that, but that is if you Google the Twinkie defense, so Dan White is the supervisor who murdered Harvey Milk and Mayor Moscone, and they used this defense of the fact that he had been eating a lot of junk food up until the murder, and it made him a little crazy. Like, that's the gist of it. I don't know all of it, but it was called the Twinkie defense. And but then I believe Dan White killed himself, so he never really dealt with the ramifications of the murder. But yeah, it's goofy.
Well, Harvey Milk was only in office like for less than a year, I think. Like, I know he'd been very prominent before
yeah, he
that.
was it wasn't very long, but he became extremely popular, right? And then Dan White was, who the hell knows, but jealous and a very sort of like family values, blah blah blah. So
yeah.
But who knows? The whole thing is really weird. And have you seen the movie Milk? With Sean Penn and the other one. Yeah, again, they filmed that on the street here, which was really fun. In fact, James Franco's trailer was in front of our house not the house we're in now, our old apartment, and so we would always hope to see James Franco because he was in the film, but we never did get to see him. But yeah.
Pivoting back slightly to the case, I'd love to ask you something that Jeff and I have discussed. The podcast is called The Doodler and the play is called Doodler.
Mm-hmm.
One of the issues I have and that we've discussed is kind of that mythologizing a murderer by giving them a name,
Like,
as opposed to having the victims forward. Now, we did say in the review that I can understand it, because the true crime space, I'm sure the like theater space as well, is pretty stacked with things, and you gotta stand out and you gotta sell. You know, you have to put that name front and center in order to sell it, I think, or in order for people to listen, in order for people to come. But I'd love your like thoughts on like, I don't know, any harm that it might be doing to draw attention to the killer. Like potentially demonizing gay men or mythologizing murderers.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like for me, what it does for me is it takes something like a doodle that is fairly benign and whimsical and turns it evil. And that to me is what's powerful about it. I look at it that way. Like I look at it as like something that you would think like, hey, like it's cute, it's a little doodle, it's a whatever, but yet this person used it as a way to then murder and do a tremendous amount of harm. I think that kind of almost lends itself to like defending the victims, because telling people to like be on alert or watch out or be careful, right? It's
don't
almost
walk
like
on your own, all that kind of stuff.
And like don't take candy from strangers, right? It's almost
that's
the
what
same
I was
thing.
just about to say. It's nearly like the doodle and the luring them
Yes.
in through that seduction is nearly like,
Yeah.
I have a dog over here, do you want to play with them?
Yeah.
Or like, I have sweets or
Yep.
candy, as the Americans would say, and like,
Yeah.
do you want them?
Yeah, I think it's kind of the same thing, and it's interesting. I couldn't, while I was watching the play, I was thinking that like I wonder what I would do if somebody came up to me and was like, "Hey, I just drew you," you know, like, wow, like that is very like, oh my God, like, dang, you know, like it's not as weird as it sounds. There's a part in this show. I don't think I'm giving anything away, but at one point, John asks someone in the audience, and he asked me to take a photo of him because the character is trying to get a fake ID to go to the bars to find the doodler. And it's weird because he's like, hey, like, pull out your phones. And then he basically says, like, okay, me, like, take a picture of me and text it to me. And I texted it to him. And so now, like, in my phone, I have this text string that I haven't deleted, which is just me texting a picture of John to John. And at first I was like, oh, that's interesting. But as I started to think about it, I was like, it's really weird. And it's almost like I became the doodler at that moment. I gave him and I didn't talk to him about it, but like there was this piece of like, I just sent him a picture of himself, which is what this guy was kind of doing to lure these people in. And granted, it was in a whole completely different, like, you know, it was not for the same reason, but I don't know, it really resonated, and I was like, wow, that's kind of weird. And it's still on my phone, and it's just this like weird picture of John like standing there smiling.
It's also really kind of powerful too.
It
right?
is. It's kind of bringing other people in, and it goes back to what we were saying earlier about living in the shadows and not being able to be your true self, because it's making me feel like he's making you complicit.
Yes.
And by all the people I'm sure who were around at the time and who might have seen the doodler but didn't come forward because of the implication to their life, their family, their work, their job. That complicit, like, if we just stand around and let this all happen,
we're
complicit, like that bystander effect.
Yeah, it's really, it's kind of eerie when you really think about it. Like, it's just like, what? And like, I was like, I should delete this string. And then I'm like, no, I'm just going to keep it. Right. I mean, well, I have his number anyway, because I'm on the board, but like, but it's still weird, right? Like, it's just, it really moved me a little bit. And, I think it's great that he was able to do that. Right. Because a lot of times audience participation can be really awkward and whatever, but this started a little awkward but ended with me really thinking, like, I still think about it now, right? It's strange.
This has been so much fun.
I
always forget how much fun it is to have someone on interviewing. And then we have someone on, I'm like, we need to do this more. It's so much fun.
It is fun. Yeah, no, and I appreciate you guys checking it out. It's definitely interesting and fun. And again, it's still an open case, which is weird, right? Like he could still be alive. So,
I know
Yeah.
it's
yeah,
yeah.
it's
The
wacky.
weirdest thing is like they think they know who it is.
Yeah, I know. I know. It's just such a strange. I mean, he's not going to do anything now, I don't think. But awesome. But no, thank you guys. This was really fun. I appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to our interview with Chris Mancini. We hope you enjoyed it. And remember that you can check out the play Doodler at the Theater Rhinoceros through March 2nd. And our full recap of the Doodler podcast will be out in your feeds on Tuesday. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to rate us, leave a comment, and let us know what you think.
Thank you all, and we'll catch you next time.
So Much Crime, So Little Time is a production of Mind Glove Media. The executive producer is Paxton Caloriso. Our associate producer is Blythe Ty. Our theme music was composed by Vyacheslav Starostin. If you haven't done it yet, please subscribe to this show on your podcast app. And don't forget to give us a 5-star rating and a review. Even better, tell your friends. To join the discussion, look for us on social media. Check out the show notes for all the links. Thanks for listening.